I was very happy to hear the words, the introductory words by everyone. And I'm really happy to see that there is this federative movement between various types of interpreting. I will tell you a bit more and make a few confessions. It will up to you to tell me what I should do in order to repent. Well, I do repent, but what my punishment will be. By the way, I thank the interpreters. I hope the interpreters did get a chance to prepare, even though I was a very naughty boy by sending 2 updates today, and the latest one was sent just about half an hour before the beginning of the sentence. But I'm a very critical person, and even more so self-critical, and whenever I read what I wrote, there's something I don't like and I want to work on it. Anyway, next slide, please. Could I have the next slide? Yes, you can see me. How did I get to find the treasure island, namely the island where there is sign language interpreting? When I started, I was very remote from that. Next slide, please. Okay, before I start this presentation, the substance, the slides contain a lot of text, much more than is generally recommended. I thought it might help the interpreters under the technological conditions, which may be somewhat uncertain. I should also like to say that I will be speaking from the viewpoint of a spoken language conference interpreter. I am not a sign language interpreter, and I'm afraid I don't speak. I don't master any sign language. So it is only one-sided, and I hope I can get the other angle as well. I will use conference interpreter, CI, as a shortened form for spoken language conference interpreting or spoken language conference interpreter, even though I know full well that sign language interpreters also deal with conference interpreting. I will say a few words about that, but please bear with me. Another thing is that I am going to make a distinction between tactics and strategies. Tactics are actions taken when facing an immediate problem, and strategies are actions taken with some planning. And I should like the interpreters to please make the same distinction. I know there's a word in Portuguese for tactics, and I know there's a word for strategies. I'm not sure about Libras, but I guess perhaps with some finger spelling, you can make the difference as well. And finally, I apologize for that, but this will be just an overview. I cannot go into any deep going analysis for obvious reasons. Next slide, please.
Just a moment, I'm gonna change the slide, sorry.
Okay. Meanwhile, while we were waiting, while I was listening, first of all, before I found the button to listen to English interpretation, I listened to the Portuguese interpretation, and I was very happy to be able to understand it, even though when I go to Brazil and people talk to each other, generally, then I don't necessarily understand. So many thanks to the Portuguese interpreter, and of course to the English interpreters as well afterwards, but it was very clear. Okay. I will say a few words about my personal background, so as to see where I come from, what is generally called the speaker's bias. And then I will say a few words about aspects of signed language interpreting, which I find particularly interesting, noteworthy for spoken language conference interpreters, and then I will give you a few ideas for some collaborative empirical research projects. Next, please. Okay, I was trained as a conference interpreter at ESIT in France. You may be familiar with the name of ESIT. It's the big leader of ESIT was Seleskovich at that time, and she was closely associated with IEC, the International Association of Conference Interpreters. IEC and Seleskovich and our teachers and us students, unfortunately, we held a very elitist view of conference interpreting. Conference interpreters were supposed to enable communication between so-called high-level speakers. So originally, at the very beginning of conference interpreting, it was heads of state, ministers, high-ranking ambassadors, generals, what have you. Then it extended to high-level, and the focus is on high-level experts in science, technology, and culture. In other words, according to IEC view, in conference interpreting, it was peers talking to peers. Everyone was well educated. Everyone was very intelligent, even though there were politicians among them. Everyone speaks his or her mother tongue. So the principle was that if conference interpreters were to do their job very well, then they also needed to be well educated, very intelligent, and they were supposed to work into their mother tongue and have a very excellent mastery of their passive languages. Next slide, please. Well, I soon found out that this was not realistic. And a few things where the theory was not in line with reality is that, first of all, we did not master perfectly all the specialized languages, the languages for special purpose, even in our A language. In other words, the legal language, economic language, technological language, scientific language, artistic language. Of course, it should have been a matter of common sense, but this is not something that we were taught. And then we were often required to work into our B language, which was against the theoretical rules and which is against the image that people often have of conference interpreting. I often read that the difference between conference interpreting and dialogue interpreting or sign language interpreting is that community interpreters or sign language interpreters work both ways and conference interpreters only work into their A language. This is not true. In many, many international conferences, including when you work for international organizations, you do work into your B language as well. I have been working for many years for OECD, for international organizations which are members of the UN family, and almost always, I was required to work into my B language as well, not just into my A language. And many speakers did not speak in their native language. Now, even when the ideal conditions were met, the truth is, and I have been criticized for pointing this out, we were not always able to produce fully accurate speeches as we were supposed to do, and speeches with very high linguistic quality, which we were also supposed to do. Actually, when I graduated from ESIT and somehow I got through and I got the degree, for a long time, I thought I was a fraud. I was an imposter because I did not manage to miss absolutely nothing. And I did not manage to interpret in perfect linguistic quality. Okay, next slide, please. I did a lot of observation and I did a lot of thinking. And then I read the relevant literature in cognitive psychology and psycholinguistics in particular, and I developed what is known as the effort models to explain these limits that I saw. But still, I'm afraid I started with a basic view of conference interpreting as it was held by IEC. In other words, the settings of conference interpreting were peer-to-peer communication, interpreters were highly qualified, and what is very important, and you'll see why a bit later, is that in my view, which I inherited from my teachers and which we held for a long, long time, the interpreter's task is defined by IEC. In other words, it is defined by ourselves, not by the client, not by the client. And our task consists in interpreting faithfully what speakers say, no translation done, no written translation, no advising, no explaining, nothing like that. I heard about community interpreting. I heard about sign language interpreting, and there were occasional contacts. But I thought these were different worlds in terms of cognition, what happens in the mind, in terms of training, in terms of requirement. I confess, I apologize for that. I had the very mistaken notion that requirements were higher from conference interpreters. And it took me a long, long time to understand this is not so. And because these were different worlds, I had no special interest in them because I was focusing on conference interpreting. Next slide, please. And then a young student called Sophie Pournin at that time, now she's called Sophie Pointurier-Pournin. I see your finger spelling the name. That's a long thing to do. She was a sign language interpreter working with French sign languages. And she came and asked me to supervise her MA thesis on lexical gaps in sign language interpreting. She had been interested in my effort models, which had been developed for conference interpreting only, as a few other people. And so she came to me. She finished a very interesting thesis, an MA thesis on lexical gaps in 2009. And while I was working with her, and I didn't know anything about the technicalities of conference interpreting, working with her raised my awareness of this particular linguistic problem that is very frequent in sign language interpreting, namely lexical gaps. And it raised my awareness of its cognitive implications, what this entails in terms of additional efforts, and also of ideological issues, some ideological issues in sign language interpreting, in particular the norms that French sign language interpreters seem to have adopted that resist any intrusion of the French language very strongly, plus some other aspects of signing. And then I was fortunate enough to draw the interest of some very generous colleagues who are sign language interpreters, very well known in the United States and probably beyond. One of them is Carol Petrie, and there are many others. And in 2010, I was invited to give a seminar for trainers of sign language interpreters, even though I knew nothing, virtually nothing about sign language interpreting. And I was fortunate enough to meet with several well-known American trainers of sign language interpreters. And we made friends, and we're still in touch with them. I have much admiration for them. And this was the beginning of a series of visits and contacts. And my interest in sign language interpreting increased. And I think one milestone was a presentation that I was invited to give in London with Jemina Napier, whom you may know, who's also a very central personality, very active researcher and a wonderful person active in sign language interpreting. By the way, Sophie Pointurier-Pournin finished her PhD in 2014 and now heads the sign language interpreting section at ESIT. Okay, so this was how I found my way to the treasure trove, thanks to the interest of colleagues. Next slide, please. Now, before I move on, I should like to explain something that will also explain what I am trying to do. When I was teaching technical translation from Japanese into French, that's in another life, I realized that my students had some major difficulties when translating from Japanese into French, including Japanese logic. The logic was a bit different. I'm not going to go into that now, but if there are questions later, I will be happy to explain. The fact that in Japanese, some linguistic descriptions were much more explicit than in French. So what do you do in French? Do you add all these types of information that are not necessary? In some other ways, Japanese is far less explicit. And what do you do in that case? Because you need to make things explicit in French. I'm sure all of you know exactly what I'm talking about, those of you who deal with sign languages, because in sign language, if I understand correctly, it's almost mandatory when you talk about entities in movement to give some information about their position, the relative position, the direction of the movement, perhaps the speed and the strength of the movement, which is not done in spoken languages. But after much observation and much reflection, I realized that all these phenomena that my French students and Japanese students, by the way, who were working between Japanese and French encountered also exist when working from other languages, including when you work from English, German, Spanish, and whatever other languages I am somewhat familiar with. They are much less frequent and they're less visible, but they can be found as well. So this is a sort of stereoscopic view. If you look at the same object from a different angle, it helps you see more clearly things that remain hidden to your view when you only use your general, taken for granted vantage point. It's pretty obvious, but even though it's pretty obvious, we are not aware of that. At least I was not aware of that. And also the tactics and strategies that are used to counter problems in one language pair may apply in other language pairs as well. Okay, next slide, please. And this is also what I find when looking at sign language interpreting and spoken language conference interpreting. I found that looking at sign language interpreting raised my awareness of things that also existed in spoken language conference interpreting. I remember when I was in Salt Lake City talking to sign language interpreters, one of them said, but you don't understand because we're special and we have problems that you don't have. And I asked, okay, what are these problems? And I realized that all these problems that he mentioned also exist in spoken language interpreting. Of course, they are much less visible. Their amplitude is much smaller, but they exist anyway. So it's worthwhile looking at them, thinking about them, studying them. So this was the initial reflection that spurred my interest in sign language interpreting. And of course, I think you cannot avoid the fact that when you look at sign language interpreting, you get interested, very interested, and perhaps moved by the human aspects of sign language interpreting. And by the way, of community interpreting as well. But I started with sign language interpreting. I only read about it. I did not get involved actively. I've never done, obviously, any sign language interpreting. Neither have I done any community interpreting. I will say a bit more about that next. Okay, so in the next part of this presentation, I will just make a few comparative points on the basis of what I explained. Next slide, please. Okay, let us start with training. According to IEC and to IEC-affiliated conference interpreting programs, okay, I see there is relay between sign language interpreters. This is fine. Languages are supposed to be fully mastered before training. And the dogma, or should I say the theory, it's a bit less critical, is that if you do not master all the languages before you start being trained, there's a risk of parroting, in other words, of doing word-for-word translation instead of interpreting on the basis of meaning and on the basis of communication needs. And this makes progress difficult, if not impossible. So this is the theory. But what did I find? First of all, I found it in the United States. And then I found that it is the case in many other countries. When students get trained to become sign language interpreters, many of them have not fully mastered their sign languages, except CODAs. And even CODAs may be very, very familiar with the relevant sign language, but perhaps more for everyday conversation with their parents, with their family, etc., perhaps not specialized languages. And then they are being trained before they master the language fully. That's interesting. So what are the consequences? Is it true that under the circumstances, they do a lot of word-for-word translation? And is it true that the quality of their interpretation stops somewhere because of that? Or can they overcome it? If you look at this more carefully, then maybe you can draw some conclusions and start experimenting with conference interpreting. You know that learning the skills for spoken language conference interpreting takes a lot of time. And in most conference interpreter training programs, you only have about 1 year or so, one academic year, which is less than 12 months, to master simultaneous, which is very, very little. Now, if you could start before that, then maybe it would produce better results. I don't know, but this is something that I think is worthwhile looking. There's also in conference interpreting the idea that consecutive interpreting, so-called long or true consecutive, in other words, with notes, is necessary before simultaneous interpreting starts. If you go directly into simultaneous interpreting, again, there's a risk of parroting and the performance, the quality of your interpretation is not very good. But in sign language interpreting, if my understanding is correct, you do simultaneous right away. Of course, consecutive is problematic. Consecutive with notes is problematic in sign language interpreting because you cannot take notes if you use your hands or if you have to look at someone signing and you cannot concentrate on taking notes and on looking at someone signing. Anyway, what are the consequences of that? can we really say that without consecutive, simultaneous is not as good? Again, I think it's worthwhile studying that. Also, in sign language interpreting, training programs, and I've read this in a number of pieces in the literature, involve engagement with a deaf community, which is often considered very, very important so that people really understand what the deaf community is all about. And it is also important for them to be, for interpreters to be better accepted. This is not applicable to conference interpreting. There is no equivalent community. So this is quite a difference. So you may have an internship, but you do not engage with the community, with a particular community that you will be interpreting for. Next slide, please. Now, a very important difference is a difference in settings. Conference interpreting is basically about international conferences. That includes political conferences, technical conferences, scientific, artistic conferences, business meetings, including board of directors meeting and financial meetings. Conference interpreters work for TV, mostly when there are important speeches by heads of state and interviews, press conferences, and in some countries, for instance, in Japan, there is systematic interpretation of the news into English. Also, high-level negotiations and various types of training, but high-level training, basically seminars, courses, and things like that. In sign language interpreting, most of the work, and again, I am quoting, it is mostly in community settings. It is very often in educational settings, but the educational settings are mostly at school level and only sometimes at university level. There is work for TV, which is similar to that of spoken language conference interpreters. There's a lot of work in negotiations, not necessarily at high level. And of course, there are international conferences. Next slide, please. In other words, sign language interpreters have a much wider spectrum than conference interpreters. Sometimes with similar requirements as conference interpreters in cognitive terms, and in cognitive terms, it is perhaps more demanding because you have more things to attend to. I have developed with Sophie Pointurier-Pournin an effort model for work into sign language interpreting, which tends to show that. Sometimes with perhaps lower cognitive load for language processing per se. In other words, you process short interventions and then you can ask for clarification. So the cognitive pressure may not be as much, but human states are much, much higher. And emotions are often linked to that, and they're much higher as well. So do sign language interpreters behave differently depending on the settings? Are their strategies the same? Are their tactics the same? Are their norms the same? For instance, when I talk about norms among French sign language interpreters, there is a very strong norm that there is no intrusion from the French national language. Sign language is sign language, and you should not bring in any words from French. But one student of mine who did an MA, who was a sign language interpreter, she did an MA observing a mathematics course at French University where the lecturer was deaf and was signing. And what he wanted, and what that student did when there were deaf students as well in other courses, is to use French words in sign language, for instance, by finger spelling, by mouthing them, all sorts of means by which the French word came through. And she said, and this is common sense, that it is obvious that this is what they need, because they have to understand what is written on the board and they have to pass exams in written form, so they have to know the French words as well. In other words, the linguistic norms are not the same. Quite interesting. So this is a very obvious example, but there may be many others, and I think it's worthwhile looking at things on in a wide spectrum and settings and see how people behave. By the way, nowadays, some conference interpreters also engage in community interpreting, either for ideological reasons. For instance, I know some conference interpreters who went to work in refugee camps, so for humanitarian reasons, and sometimes for economic reasons, because there just isn't enough work for conference interpreters, so they have to do both. But this is quite remote from the initial definition by Hayek of conference interpreting. And again, this is something that gives us food for thought. We should, I think, devote a lot of thinking to that. Next slide, please. And then, of course, questions arise about the role of interpreter, or should I say the roles of interpreters. There's a lot of sign language interpreting research on this topic, and there's almost nothing in conference interpreting research. My attention was drawn to that initially by an edited volume edited by Terry Jansen from Canada, who with a number of very interesting papers, thought-provoking papers on the role of interpreters. And it got me thinking. I never thought about it as a conference interpreting. Again, in the settings of conference interpreter, you have communication between peers. There's high level of education. All of them have power. And the role, the interpreter's role, is apparently not problematic. But in the setting of sign language interpreting, it's mostly community type, often different levels of education and power. And the question is, who and what do you serve? And how do you serve the cause or the persons that you serve, including commitment to the deaf community? And I have read some papers and some doctoral dissertations where people said explicitly that they believe they are there to serve the deaf community and oppressed community. So these are very relevant questions, even if you do not take on board the idea that interpreters need to help defend the rights of an oppressed community. So these questions are common to sign language interpreting and community interpreting, but we conference interpreters have not given enough thought to them. Next slide, please. But when you look at conference interpreting more closely, beyond the theory, beyond the dogma, the model whereby we're just a conduit, we're just transparent and just say what the speaker says, are not fully adequate. And this model has to be reconsidered. For instance, we have to admit, we have to become aware of the fact, and I became aware of that a bit late, I'm afraid, that we are hired in a communication context. So in prototypical international conferences, we are generally not expected to facilitate, we're just expected to facilitate immediate communication, nothing beyond that. But even then, what do we do when speakers are poor speakers, either because they're under a lot of stress, or because they're not so well educated, or because they speak a foreign language? What should we do? If we are expected to facilitate immediate communication, then maybe some intervention is legitimate. And how about other settings that are not prototypical? negotiations between heads of states, between ministers, between businessmen, businesswomen. There are interesting books, and one was in English. I read other texts in Japanese about diplomatic interpreters who definitely had to intervene and were expected to intervene, and the heads of state, ministers, etc., were glad that they intervened in order to mediate a bit between the people so that there are no misunderstandings. TV interpreting is the same. So, is the transparent conduit role adequate? It is not in line with the wishes of the clients, not in line with the wishes of the clients. So, is it legitimate for us to still consider that we, AIC, or conference interpreters working under AIC theory or under AIC principles, is it legitimate for us to impose this on clients? Is it at all possible? I don't think it's possible, because clients are stronger now. We're no longer in a market where we can dictate our conditions. We have to follow them, and this is increasingly so in this world. And by the way, codes of conduct of sign language interpreting are not necessarily very suited either. Annette Miner wrote a very interesting paper that I reviewed in the Syrian Bulletin on designated interpreters, on interpreters who worked regularly for deaf professionals in a hearing environment. And what they expected their interpreters to do was quite different from the role of interpreters as defined by codes of conduct. And Miner says that these interpreters were a bit worried that other interpreters might think that their work was not ethical, that they were not good professionals. But in my view, they were good professionals in the sense that they had a job to perform. This is what they were hired for. In other words, the codes of conduct have to adapt. So reading the literature on sign language interpreting has been an eye-opener. Next slide, please. Now, language issues. There is a lot of research on sign languages per se. This is technical. This will not be addressed here. A very, very interesting technical issue has to do with international sign language. Very, very interesting, which deserves a lot of studies. But even without looking at that, many non-standard signers of sign language are found, I think, in every sign language interpreter's daily life. People who learned a variety of sign language. It is not standard because they come from a different school, from a different area, etc. Sometimes they're difficult to understand for sign language interpreters. Sometimes they find it difficult to understand the standard sign language that is being used by the sign language interpreter. So what do you do about that? In conference interpreting, the only similar problem is the use of non-native language by speakers. So the two could be compared. Again, the lexical gaps. Lexical gaps are something that exists in conference interpreting as well. It exists in community interpreting, but lexical gaps are far less frequent. So what is interesting to look at is, in sign language interpreting, what tactics are used? What is their relative cost as regards time? For instance, if a word is missing or a sign, a lexicalized sign is missing for a word in the spoken language, and if you're not allowed to use the, let's say, a finger-spelled word or a mouthed word in sign language, and you decide to create a whole scene, you put an entity in your signing space and another entity, and then you show everything, it takes a lot of time. It could take 1, 2, 3, 4 seconds. And during that time, the speaker continues to speak, what will your working memory do? Will you be able to catch up, or will you lose something? According to the small study done by Sophie Pointurier-Pournin for her MA and also in her PhD, this does have a cost because it takes too long and people tend to lose some information. Interesting. Another point is, how does this affect quality perception? It seems that for some interpreters, in order to remain credible, in order to keep the trust of the deaf, they prefer to be idiomatic and use only signs, iconic languages, and resist the intrusion of the spoken language. And even deaf people prefer that to something that is perfectly accurate information-wise. That's quite interesting. That's a bit surprising, but this again is something that needs to be explored. Next slide, please. Quality perception. Conference interpreters believe that users perceive the quality of their interpretation depending on informational accuracy. In other words, how much information, how accurate the information they render is, and on the basis of the quality of the language, and on the basis of the quality of their presentation, quality of the voice, quality of the prosody, in other words, the music of their speech, etc. And behavioral aspects seem to be neglected. I did mention behavioral aspects on the basis of my own experience, but only in passing. In sign language interpreting research, several investigators talk about the importance of trust by deaf users. Many of them seem to consider that the two main elements that will make them trust computers is confidentiality and the fact that you can trust them, and commitment to the deaf community. Sometimes they prefer that to informational accuracy. Interesting. And I wonder, could this be the case in conference interpreting as well, contrary to the theory? Again, I think investigations are required. Surveys and interviews that are out of context are not very reliable for that. Probably ethnographic research would be more powerful. And the more I think about it, the more I see that ethnographic research, which is basically qualitative, seems more powerful to give us some practical answers than quantitative research. Next slide, please. Next question. Conference interpreters tend to worry about the objective quality of their output. Did they miss something? Did they not miss something? Did they make many language errors or language infelicities, clumsy output? And how their quality was perceived. But they do not worry so much about how much users actually understand. Whereas in sign language interpreting research, I have found several studies that actually looked at comprehension rates. Very, very instructive. I think this is quite essential considering that interpreting is a service, not just a performance. I think we conference interpreters tended to look at interpreting as a performance, but no, it is mostly a service. And I think studies could be undertaken to compare rates of understanding with or without interpretation. It would probably put informational accuracy in a more practical perspective. Actually, we know that there is some loss even in direct communication without interpreting. And by the way, in a nice Japanese book, it is written in Japanese, so it's not available for people who don't read Japanese, and I think it's no longer available in print. A book written in 1969, Nishiyama Sen, one very, very well-known interpreter, Japanese-American, mentioned that there is some loss even in direct communication. There is some loss which is inherent to interpreting. The question is, if you combine the two, what is better? Where do you lose more? If the interpreter is good, speaks or signs very clearly, perhaps even though some information is lost for various reasons, still people understand more from the interpreter than they would understand in their native language from the speaker. Again, interesting. I think in sign language interpreting, it's even more relevant. Is there more tolerance towards informational inaccuracy of interpretation? Next, please. Now, there are common cognitive issues. In sign language interpreting, I assume that there is frequent cognitive saturation. In other words, you go beyond the maximum that you can do as regards your mental effort, and interpreters give up on some information in the speech because they think that there will be cognitive saturation if they go on. This was challenged on the basis of a theoretical psychological construct, but I'm not convinced. There is too much evidence that comes from the field, from interpreters. Also, there are some disagreements in cognitive psychology about this particular theory. So what happens in sign language interpreting? Is there such a thing as cognitive saturation? Do you sometimes feel that what is required of you in terms of mental efforts to interpret fully and with very good language quality, be it sign language or spoken language, is it more than you can give? Evidence from Sophie Pointurier suggests there is, but what about your own experience? Next slide, please. I'm trying to go a bit faster so as not to take too much time. So, for instance, we could go and use a survey, which I am using now with spoken language interpreting. And if you wish, perhaps we can extend it to sign language interpreting. For instance, if I asked you, how often do you experience the feeling that in a particular sentence or sequence of sentences, the effort required to render all the information is close to your maximum capacity or even beyond it? Never, sometimes, rather frequently, or very frequently. And then you look at various settings, in conference settings or TV settings, as opposed to community settings, when you work from a sign language into a spoken language, when you work from a spoken language into a sign language. And if that happens, how often do you decide to omit part of the information in a sentence? Never, sometimes, frequently, very frequently, again, in different settings. Next slide, please. When interpreting a particular sentence or sequence of sentences, did you sometimes think that this was very close to your maximum as regards information, and you chose to give up on perfect language quality to be able to render as much information as possible? I think it happens in conference interpreting quite often. And I think perhaps it happens a bit less often when you work into sign language because you need to maintain acceptability by sign language interpreting, by the deaf community. In other words, again, a comparison. And when interpreting, how often do you experience the feeling that because you finished interpreting one sentence when the speaker was well into the next sentence, you missed something in the next sentence? Again, this may be different in conference or TV settings, in community settings where interventions are very short, when working into a spoken language and working into a sign language. Remember, I told you about lexical gaps and the various tactics that you use when there is a lexical gap. Then perhaps it happens more often when you work into a sign language than when you work into a spoken language. So Would anyone among you be interested in launching such a survey, a common project with sign language interpreters and with conference with spoken language interpreters, and launch a comparison and see what happens? Next slide, please. Okay, I'm almost through. Other potential projects in which we could collaborate. Just a few examples. For instance, what kind of information do conference interpreters and sign language interpreters miss or add in speeches? For instance, I know that sign language interpreters add in speeches information about what happens in the room, sometimes about the accent of the speaker, things that conference interpreters never do in various settings. What are the reasons for errors and omissions in conference interpreting and sign language interpreting? The various problem triggers that we know, names, numbers, whatever, various tactics, maybe interference from the deaf audience. In Dr. Barbosa's doctoral dissertation, I found a very interesting comments, very interesting data about that, where the deaf audience helps, but the deaf audience also interferes. And one of my hypotheses, as you might have guessed, is lexical gaps is a major problem trigger in sign language interpreting, not in conference interpreting. Okay, how much do conference interpreting listeners understand as opposed to sign language interpreting listeners? How sensitive are conference interpreting listeners versus sign language interpreting users to omissions in interpretations? Of course, all of these projects require many experiments focusing on different situations, on different types of information. Next, please. Okay, I hope I have convinced you that I'm talking to sign language interpreters, that your difficult and very complex work has many sides to it that should attract spoken language interpreters, the interest of spoken language interpreters. We can learn a lot from you. And I do hope that some of you will want to engage in cooperative collaboration. I will continue to read sign language interpreting literature and to talk about sign language interpreting literature and about sign language interpreting around me. And I thank you very much for your attention. And I thank the interpreter, of course.
Dr. Gile, thank you very much for your presentation. It was a wonderful talk. We have many comments in the chat saying that they loved your talk, that your topics were amazing. And we have, for now, we have 2 questions for you. The first question is by Suzanne Lima. She's asking that because you mentioned in your talk that usually in interpreter training, at least for spoken languages, consecutive interpreting precedes simultaneous interpreting, but that does not happen. For sign language interpreters. She's asking if this kind of reasoning is actually the right way to go for training new professionals, or if this is a myth, or if we have enough support for that approach in research nowadays.
It's an excellent question. I have been challenging this assumption for a long time. And I think I saw very recently one piece of empirical evidence that I haven't read it yet, but I think the conclusion was from the abstract that there is no advantage to starting with consecutive interpreting. I wrote a short paper a long time ago about the advantages of consecutive interpreting before simultaneous interpreting, but this is more relevant for conference interpreters in as regards diagnosis of problems. Otherwise, I think that some some consecutive, but very short while would be very, very interesting without notes, just consecutive interpreting, but of rather long segments of a few minutes would be probably useful, because this would show people that problems occur not just because of language switching, but because this has to do with a way of listening, a way of analyzing what the speaker says. But this could go over maybe 2, 3, or 4 weeks, and then you could go into simultaneous, perhaps. I do not think that the advantages of spending a whole academic year on consecutive only is good enough to offset the disadvantage of having only 1 year of training in simultaneous before the end of the program. And this is perhaps the reason why in some conference interpreter training programs, including those that have a very good reputation, they do start simultaneously, simultaneous interpreting and consecutive, even if they do some consecutive by the side, so it helps do some diagnosis, but at the same time, people get used to simultaneous. So I think this is one of the dogmas that are probably not justified, but I don't have any empirical evidence. This is just my gut feeling.
Great. We have another question from Annelise Gondar. She's asking, Professor Gile, considering this remote interpreting that is growing up nowadays because of pandemics, should we revise the effort model?
Yes, I've already started doing that, but the question is, I think that this is moving. What is happening is that if the technical arrangements are very good, if you do not need to switch between 2 or 3 computers, as happened when I was interpreted when giving a lecture to Japan from Paris with interpretation into Japanese because I was speaking English, the colleagues had to listen to, had two sets of headsets. And there were problems because she had to listen to the moderator and to the other interpreters in order to know when to take over. I think these are technical issues that could be taken care of. And then there is a question of psychological resistance. And then there is a question of, do we find things easier after a period of learning, or do they still are they still more stressful? If you're familiar with the history of conference interpreting, people were very happy with consecutive interpreting, and the pioneers said, no, simultaneous interpreting is no good. Simultaneous interpreting will never work. It's not as accurate as all that. They resisted the change, but then after a while, simultaneous interpreting became standard. And when you actually compare the performance, I did a small study on that. When you compare the performance in simultaneous and in consecutive, it is not clear at all that consecutive is better. Maybe you get, I'm talking about long consecutive, not about short consecutive on a sentence by sentence basis, or very short utterance and a short reply. Some things get lost because of note taking, whereas they don't get lost in simultaneous. And some things are better in consecutive because you know where the speaker is going. You have more time to get used to the speaker's accent, to the speaker's way of thinking, etc. So we still don't know. Actually, if you ask me all sorts of questions, I would give you my general answers would be, I don't know. I cannot present any evidence, but I would really like to have more evidence and really like to explore things, knowing that empirical research will not necessarily give me the answer. There may be a lot of uncertainty that will remain. Sorry for a long answer.
No, you're fine. It was a nice answer. I just want to remember our audience that you can ask questions in sign language if you want. Just let us know in the chat, and then we will allow you to open your camera so you can ask questions directly in sign. Okay.
I would welcome input from deaf people or sign language interpreters who speak in sign language.
Good. We have a final comment from Edric Correa. They are asking if you have any website or any place where we can find your works, your publications, where you share your work.
Well, if you're really interested in some of my publications, you could look at the Cirin site, CIRIN, Cirin site. And then you have a list of publications. And then if you ask me to send you something, as long as you don't ask me to send you a book, a full book, because publishers invest a lot of money on books and generally they lose money. So I think it wouldn't be honest of me to send books. But if you're asking for papers, I will be glad to. And if somebody asks questions, if they want to consult with me on something, I'd be very happy. But there are so many very good researchers, not me, people who are younger, people who are very active, who find out lots of things. Why don't you look at the Cirin Bulletin and get in touch with them and see what they can offer? I'll be happy to offer what I can, but I think that my contribution is perhaps less than what these younger people can offer you now.
Good. So since we don't have any more questions, I will just give maybe more 10 to 15 seconds. Okay, we have a new question from Vinicius Nascimento. And he's asking about the social aspect of simultaneous interpreting and how this can have an effect, mostly negative effect, in the interpreter's task.
Yes, I can see the question in Portuguese. By the way, I'm familiar with the names of many of you from having read some stuff. So hello, I'm not saying hello to every one of you personally, but I'm very happy to see the names. There was one very interesting and a bit frustrating MA thesis, I think, by someone called Schlesinger. It's not Miriam Schlesinger, but I think maybe it was her sister or one of her children, maybe one of her children, one of her daughters, about so-called vicarious trauma, the effects on interpreting of having to interpret in emotionally stressful situations. The problem is, and I've read a few more papers on that, I think the problem is that the studies conducted so far have indicators that are not very sensitive. Indicators are the variables that are used to measure something. And indicators need to be reliable, they need to be specific, but they need to be sensitive as well. If you use, for instance, the number of consultations, do interpreters consult with psychologists or psychiatrists to have some help? We do not know what the effects were until they reached that stage. Maybe there were very strong effects, but not quite strong enough for them to go and consult. It's very difficult. We could look at things experimentally, but experimentally, for instance, simulating a situation which induces stress, for instance, somebody talking about violence, about rape, about oppression, about sexism, about racism, about something like that. But there are ethical rules in research, and you're not supposed to harm participants in research. So provoking any potentially harmful effect is very problematic. So I think perhaps the best way to look at it would be to look at the literature in clinical psychology and look at the way people have measured such effects, the influence of stress, the influence of emotions on various types of behavior, and maybe you could find some indications on that. I can tell you it's just an anecdote. It's worth just an anecdote, not more than that. And I'm sure that many of you will tell you the same thing. I once interpreted in consecutive for someone on the radio. It was someone who was a wonderful person who was born handicapped and became a guide in Alaska and wrote an excellent book. And the way he talked, his personality gave such positive emotions that I felt that my consecutive was far better. It was anyway far easier than in many other situations. Is it true, or is it just a false impression? I don't know, but this is just an anecdote. So you could measure anecdotes, you could use surveys, but surveys are not necessarily very sensitive. So I really don't know. Again, my standard answer, I don't know. I would like to know better.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Gile. This was a wonderful lecture. We have a lot of comments in the chat saying that they loved your presentation and how intriguing everything you brought is, especially trying to thought-provoke spoken language interpreters and researchers to think and to consider sign language interpreter, how different aspects that have been considered for sign language interpreting research, and that has mostly been neglected by spoken language research. So thank you so much. Unfortunately, we ran out of time, but we cannot thank you enough for having this, such a pleasure to hear you and to have you here with us.
Much.
Thank you so much.